In the early days of the Pacific War, there was a prevailing belief among military strategists that the tank was a creature of the open desert or the rolling plains of Europe. The jungle, with its suffocating humidity, dense canopy, and treacherous mud, was supposed to be the graveyard of armor. For the first year of the conflict, the Japanese infantry seemed to prove this theory right. When American M3 Stuart light tanks first stumbled into the green hell of Guadalcanal and Buna, they didn't look like apex predators. They looked like trapped beasts. They were blind, deaf, and incredibly vulnerable. Japanese soldiers, hidden in spider holes covered by palm fronds, would wait for the clanking monsters to pass, then spring up with a terrifying, almost suicidal bravery to jam magnetic mines against the steel hulls or thrust TNT charges into the tracks. To the hardened veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army, the American tank was not something to be feared, it was something to be hunted. There was a certain grim confidence, perhaps even a dark humor, in how the Japanese infantry approached anti-tank warfare in those early years. They knew that a tank in the jungle was isolated. If you stripped away its infantry support, the machine became helpless. They developed tactics that relied on spirit and stealth rather than heavy firepower. They used lunge mines, shaped charges on the end of bamboo poles, and would charge screaming from the undergrowth, effectively trading one life for one tank. It was a brutal calculus, but it worked. The terrified American crews inside, buttoned up and sweltering in 100-degree heat, could barely see 5 yards in front of them. The Japanese infantrymen felt a sense of superiority. He was the master of the terrain, and this clumsy steel box was an intruder that could be defeated with simple courage and a satchel charge. But the war did not stay in the jungle. As the United States Navy began its island-hopping campaign, the terrain shifted from the rotting vegetation of New Guinea to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, and here the Japanese strategy evolved from mobile ambushes to the most formidable defensive network the world had ever seen. They stopped trying to meet the Americans on the beaches and instead dug in. They built bunkers out of coconut logs, steel reinforcing bars, and concrete, buried deep under layers of coral sand. These weren't just foxholes, they were fortresses. The battle for Tarawa in November 1943 was the wake-up call. American Marines stormed the beaches and found themselves being slaughtered by machine gun fire coming from pillboxes that seemed impervious to destruction. A standard high-explosive tank shell fired from a Sherman or a Stuart would slam into these bunkers and simply detonate on the surface. The coconut logs, fibrous and spongy, absorbed the shockwaves in the shrapnel like a sandbag. The Japanese defenders inside, concussed but alive, would simply shake off the dust and keep firing. The Americans tried armor-piercing rounds, but these would punch clean through the bunker without exploding, leaving the gunners inside unharmed. It was a tactical nightmare. The American tanks would roll up, fire point-blank range, and achieve nothing. The Japanese defenders were no longer laughing, but they were certainly holding their ground with a terrifying resilience. They knew that as long as they stayed deep in their holes, the tanks couldn't touch them. The stalemate required a solution that was as horrific as it was effective. The conventional methods of warfare, bullets and explosives, were failing. The Americans needed something that could turn corners, something that could flow through the firing slits of a bunker and consume the oxygen inside. They needed fire. The concept of the flamethrower was not new, but the delivery system was. Man-portable flamethrowers were heavy, dangerous, and had a pitiably short range. A Marine carrying a flamethrower had to walk within 20 yards of a machine gun nest to use it, a suicidal proposition that resulted in horrific casualty rates. The engineers realized they needed to mount the weapon on something that could take a hit. They needed to marry the flame to the tank. The first experiments were hasty conversions, often done in field workshops by Seabees and mechanics who were improvising with whatever they had. They took the M3 Stuart light tanks, removed the 37mm main guns, and replaced them with Ronson flamethrowers. They dubbed these creations Satans. The name was fitting. The Satan tank carried 760 gallons of thickened fuel, napalm, which allowed it to fire a stream of liquid fire up to 80 yards. This was the game changer. Suddenly, the tank didn't have to drive right up to the bunker's embrace. It could sit back, outside the range of the lunge mines and magnetic charges, and unleash a stream of burning death. The debut of these mechanized dragons changed the psychology of the Pacific War instantly. When the Satan tanks rolled onto the islands of Peleliu and Saipan, the dynamic shifted. The Japanese infantry, who previously felt safe behind their walls of concrete and logs, found that their fortifications had become ovens. The terrifying sound of the compressed air being released, a sharp hiss followed by a roar like a jet engine, became the sound of impending doom. The stream of napalm didn't just burn on contact, it splashed against the back walls of the bunkers, filling the enclosed spaces with sticky, burning jelly. It sucked the oxygen out of the air, suffocating those it didn't incinerate. The laughter stopped. The confidence that the terrain favored the defender evaporated. The Japanese troops, disciplined and ready to die for the emperor, were now faced with a weapon against which courage was irrelevant. You could not bayonet a stream of liquid fire. You could not ambush a tank that was burning down the entire jungle around you. As the war moved closer to Japan, the tanks got bigger and the flames got hotter. The light Stuart tanks were replaced by the M4 Sherman Zippo tanks. These medium tanks retained their heavy armor and often kept their main gun, with the flamethrower mounted alongside or in place of the bow machine gun. This allowed the tank to blast a bunker open with a high explosive shell and then spray the interior with napalm to ensure no one survived. The tactic became known as blowtorch and corkscrew. The tanks, the blowtorch, would burn out the fortifications, while the infantry, the corkscrew, would move in to seal the caves and bunkers with explosives. The battle for Iwo Jima saw this horror reach its industrial zenith. The island was essentially one massive, hollowed-out fortress. The Japanese commander, General Kuribayashi, had forbidden banzai charges, ordering his men to kill 10 Americans for every one of their own lives. They hid in caves connected by miles of tunnels. Conventional artillery was useless. Bombardment from battleships was useless. The only way to dig them out was to burn them out. Sherman flamethrower tanks would trundle up the volcanic slopes, their tracks grinding on the black ash. They would approach a cave entrance that had been spitting machine gun fire for hours. The turret would turn, the nozzle would align, and a rod of orange flame would shoot into the darkness. The capacity of these larger tanks meant they could sustain the fire for nearly a minute, pouring hundreds of gallons of fuel into the underground complexes. The psychological effect on the Japanese defenders was shattering. Diaries recovered later from the caves spoke of the fire monsters and the absolute helplessness of watching the flames pour down the ventilation shafts. The Japanese infantry, who years earlier had hunted tanks in the jungles of Guadalcanal with nothing but mines on sticks, were now sealed inside mountains, waiting for the inevitable hiss of the Zippo. By the time the Americans reached Okinawa, the flamethrower tank had become the primary siege engine of the Pacific. The battles had devolved into a slow, grinding process of extermination. The tank crews, protected by inches of steel, were somewhat removed from the visceral horror of what they were doing, but not entirely. They could smell the roasting meat through the vents of their vehicles. They could see the enemy soldiers rushing out of the caves, bodies wreathed in flame, preferring to be cut down by machine gun fire rather than burned to death inside. It was a grim, mechanical slaughter that stripped away any romantic notion of warrior spirit. The evolution from the clumsy, blind tanks of 1942 to the fire-breathing Shermans of 1945 mirrors the trajectory of the war itself. It started with a clash of wills and tactics, where a brave soldier with a mind could stop a machine. It ended with the total dominance of industrial power, where technology rendered human bravery meaningless. The Japanese infantrymen, who had once looked at the American tank with disdain, realized too late that the enemy had adopted. They had turned the tank from a vehicle of maneuver into a weapon of annihilation. In the final assessment, the flamethrower tank was a necessary evil for the American forces. Without it, the casualty projections for taking islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa were unthinkable. The Zippos saved thousands of American lives by allowing them to neutralize fortifications from a distance. But for the men on the other side of the aperture, for the soldiers of the Imperial Army huddled in the dark, damp bunkers, the arrival of the tank ceased to be a tactical problem and became a vision of hell. The jungle, the coral, and the caves could no longer protect them. The armor they had once mocked had returned to consume them, leaving nothing behind but scorched concrete and silence. The age of the bunker was over. The age of the flame had begun.